Keeping in line with what is the continued paradigm shift, evolution process, change management process, basically everything is changing around us. So too are the emergency communication centers, as I made reference earlier this morning. It seems like 2 days ago, but it was only this morning that we opened the session. Whether it is the process issues, whether it's driven by the policy, whether it is most certainly the operational requirements, or whether it's the supporting technologies, there's been a boatload of changes that have happened in the emergency communication centers. And there are not only the consumers of the data, they're the responders that utilize the information, and there are the operators and the practitioners that need support in the process, however it is that we can help them. To that end, our chair of the Emergency Communications and Response Advisory Committee, which is one of 7 different committees that the IJIS Institute frames, supports, fosters, will be guiding us through the process today. He not only is our chair, but he's also the vice president, if I'm not mistaken, for SmartResponse. Did I just promote you? Did I demote you? What did I do?
No, you got it.
I got it on the, I nailed it. Okay, I remembered well. I will let Ed go for what is the introduction of our other panelists, but I will say that we have representation from Collier County Sheriff's Office, National Institute of Health and Standards and Technology, and Mission Critical Partners. And the reason I bring up the organizations is not that I don't trust that our moderator will in fact touch on that and speak to their quals individually, but that yet again, this shows that the topic, the discussion, and the outputs seek to be as well-rounded as it possibly can be, get the different perspectives, and ultimately come up with next steps or lessons learned that we could share with practitioners, with service providers, with anyone that could ultimately support the mission space. So Ed, I am going to pass it over to you. I don't know if you want to chat from there. It's your choice.
I'm going to stay seated if I can, because I hate being pinned behind a podium. Really, if I could, I'd be like the speaker earlier today, and I'd walk around and be animated, but I'll spare you that. So thank you, Maria. Rather than me try and do justice and remember all of the talking points for the panel that I'm with, and certainly I get the privilege of leading this, but this is where the expertise is. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Just take a few seconds to introduce themselves. Sarah.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you, IJIS, for having me. I'm Sarah Hughes. I work at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. I'm with the Public Safety Communication Research Division. We've been around for several years, but from land mobile radio testing to interoperability after September 11th, and now really focused on next generation communication technology for police, fire, and EMS. In order to do that well, we really need to understand the transition from ECCs to kind of the boots on the ground first responders or incident command. So excited to join my panelists and share a little bit of what we've been discovering the past few years too. So thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bob Finney. I'm the Director of Communications Technology at the Collier County Sheriff's Office. Collier County's southwest Florida, down the Naples, Marco Island area. I've been in 911 for about 27 years. I actually started in the Pacific Northwest in the state of Washington as a dispatcher and moved down here for the sunshine and palm trees. And it had several different roles within 911, including the director of a communications center, and now primarily handling the not necessarily the IT function, but some of the technology we're going to talk about in our session today.
Thanks, Bob. Good afternoon. Jim Pingel. I'm with Mission Critical Partners. I manage our data integration and analytics unit. Mission Critical Partners has consulting and lifecycle managed services divisions, really spanning the entire public safety, criminal justice ecosystem, if you will, from emergency communication centers through law enforcement, courts, corrections, the entire ecosystem. So Maria asked me to substitute and represent industry on this dais. So I'm sitting here looking out at the room at 80% industry members. I'm going to represent you. Hopefully I do that well. I will bring 18 years of being an IJIS member, hopefully be able to fairly characterize your take on emergency communications as an evolving discipline. But I also benefit from the company that I'm with the consulting practices around next generation 911, as well as 911 in general. So be able to bring some of the knowledge from the rest of the company. So looking forward to this. Thanks for giving us your time.
So thank you all for being here. In case I forget to do that at the end, I appreciate you taking your time. As has been mentioned, the whole concept of an ECC, or the name earlier this morning was a PSAP. I still interchange those two, and every time I do it, I try to remind myself that they're really not interchangeable anymore. The comment was made as that the day started that it used to be if you were in a PSAP, you answered a phone and maybe you wrote something on a piece of paper and then you talked to somebody on a radio. I don't need to tell this group, but the ECCs of today have evolved. They're very, very different. There's a lot more going on. We're going to try in the short period of time that we talked, we kind of had a pre-conference. I think we talked longer than they wished us to, and we kind of got off on many tangents and thought, okay, well, we won't have too much trouble filling up the time. As a matter of fact, I'm waiting for George in just a moment to go, hey, your time's up, and we've lost that. So rather than me spend a whole lot of time talking, thanks, George, I appreciate that, we wanted to start to look, as this evolution changed, to look at some of the impacts. One of the first places we wanted to talk about is staffing. And I don't need to tell this group, staffing as a whole is a challenge. So we don't want to look at the staffing shortage. What we're trying to look at is, as the data and the systems are evolving, what does that mean for staffing changes? It's not just that person now that's going to answer the phone. It's not just that person that can talk on the radio. There's a lot more going on. Sarah, I know you mentioned also there's more demands being placed, not only from the public, but from the responders in the field. So, Bob, I know you kind of wanted to start with this one, so I'll let you start on, how are we seeing that evolution and what's its impact on the needs that are, the physical needs inside the ECCs?
Sure, and I thought maybe it would be good to take a step back real quick, not knowing everyone in the audience, and I was thinking about Maria's comment earlier about the barbaric processes in 911, and truly it has been, and barbaric systems. And while I was in Washington, I was as a volunteer firefighter and EMT, so I can say this, but in the fire industry, it's often said, 100 years of tradition and culture unimpeded by progress. And there's a culture in 911, and it's not just a fear of progress, but 911, if you think, it is a 53-year-old technology. It was basically 1968 when the United States decided to go to a three-digit number that everyone could easily dial, regardless of where you were, and you'd be delivered to the closest PSAP. That's actually where the term came from. And if you think back, and I think a lot of us, hopefully most of us here can, what was it like before that, right? Well, in your phone book or on your fridge, you had a 10-digit number for the local fire department or your local police precinct, and when you needed help, that's who you called. And the fire department you called, they knew you were calling because it was a fire, right? The police department had a pretty good indication that when you were calling them that you needed the police. We didn't have, we talked about GIS and mapping. We didn't have a lot of that. It was the call taker, their ear, most people knew the neighborhoods and they responded to. And that's how business was done. 911 was a mission critical, or the phone, I should say, even before 911, was that a mission critical technology. And the other mission critical technology that we probably won't talk about today, but you mentioned it, is the radio system, getting that first responder to the scene. And that the telecommunications industry, or the practitioners, have really been a guardian of that mission critical technology, good, bad, or otherwise. That technology, that 50-year-old technology, is most of what we're still using across the country today. We're talking about, moving to next generation 911. It's going to take some money, but it will bring a lot of additional data. That brings fear to those practitioners who have known that, we have to get that phone call from the citizens, from the community. We have to get a first responder going, and seconds count. And anything else you put in that process can complicate things. Of course, then 911 came along, and that was beneficial. People started consolidating in areas, but it's interesting, if you call 911, and I was just thinking through this today, you call 911 now, and oftentimes you're going to get 911, police, fire, or medical. And sometimes now they're answering mental health. Why is that? because now you don't know why somebody's calling. Or you may get 911, what's the location of your emergency? And that's because we're using these devices 85% of the time when we call 911, and the system wasn't designed around that. And so we've made, by technology, in some ways we've made it easier, but we've complicated the process and added more time. And so I just say that as a basis as we start discussing things, because whether it's staffing, whether it's moving to next gen and additional data, how is that affecting the process and not adding time to it, that golden hour, those few seconds that really matter. And then you throw in everything that's happened the last couple of years. I mean, staffing was never great. Getting those butts in the seats to answer the calls was never easy. But now it's like, hey, I can go over here and work for X company that does everything remotely. I can work from home. That's not necessarily something that's we're flexible enough to do in the ECC. Technology is getting there. There were several use cases during the pandemic, but there's policy questions. Interestingly, one of the use cases was up in the Metro DC area, where you've got employees coming from several different states, and if working from home, you'd be crossing state lines, which is, creates some sieges, some policy issues. So there's a lot of policy questions. There's a lot of hesitancy on resilience and reliability. But looking at some, and I'll just touch on this one from staffing, looking at a way that we can become more flexible and maybe not allowing someone to work from home. Maybe you could. Some agencies are trying it. There's an agency in North Carolina, they call it the Bunny Slippers program, and they were actually talking about this before the pandemic, to where dispatchers could work from home. That technology is coming out there if you can get past the policies. But can you spread out facilities? And we've been looking at it in Collier County, our backup center. We went live with that during the pandemic just to spread people out, and we found that more people would come in and work overtime because it was closer to their house. And we're looking at actually opening other centers now that we can virtually have several centers that all are operating within the same, the same confines, so to speak. It provides some benefits and attractions to people that may otherwise want to just leave the industry altogether. I'll just touch on that one point right now. And I hope the level set helps. I know it was a little bit of history, but I think it does play a role into how technology is impacting the ECC and how this data can make a difference as we move along.
And if I could pick up on again, most of the communication technology that we are trying to research and develop will be 5 to 10 years out, but it's going to be used by the actual police, fire, and EMS workers, or the incident commanders. But a lot of when we have conversations about their technology needs and what they're looking for the futures, they start out with the baseline respect for the ECC. Many of them have done shifts before just to really understand. So baseline respect is there. But also they acknowledge that their role as a first responder is revolutionizingly changed. Like, it is so different in the past 5 years. And so they are calling and asking demands of their operations centers of things that they've not been asked to do before. They're researching items on the internet for them. They're becoming data specialists. Those are not skill sets that they were originally hired for, that sometimes the municipality has to pay for them. So that's kind of some of the topics that they recognize as a first responder. They're asking new demands of their emergency communication centers personnel. And the other aspect that we've kind of touched on a little bit in our conversations is the emotional health of first responders and public safety is a huge issue right now, and that starts with the Emergency Communications Center. They do not know the outcome most of the time in the country. There's not a loop back. So they don't know the outcome of what happens after they are done talking to the person in crisis or in the Emergency Communications Center. So when we talk about new technology that will kind of integrate systems together, that's one of the key aspects that for the Emergency Communications Center that we've been beginning to hear, that they want to have some kind of emotional loop back. They may not need to know all of the details of what happened, but they need to know generally, like, was that person okay? Or how were you okay when I called for you as the first responder to respond to that incident? They're hearing the traffic, they know what's going on, but they often never hear the outcome. That is a huge emotional toll that we are putting on Emergency Communications Center. So again, kind of another call to the technology community as we're thinking about integrating or kind of sharing data, the loop back of information is something to consider as well.
That's a good point. So just a couple of things to add on. That evolution from PSAP to ECC, I use the two terms interchangeably too, but when you start thinking about answering point, you realize that the job and technology has changed the job. You can't talk about staffing without talking about the role of data. I mean, part of that, you can characterize that evolution as we've just inundated the dispatcher, and the telecommunicator to some degree too when they're separate, whose job used to be, kind of this flowing the information out to first responders. They've got much, much more information, and I think industry's done a good job of packaging that information in some really clever ways. So, in other words, be able to provide the awareness of what else is going on out there or on that specific address that I'm dispatching. I think the challenge for industry is start looking at using machine learning and AI to help reduce data overload. We've gone through this trend of pushing as much information through those floodgates, through that IP-based network as we can, because we could. Now what can we do to help the dispatcher focus, right? I mean, what pieces of information, if it's domestic, that answer is different than it is if it's a traffic crash, but can we help the systems and help focus the types of data that dispatcher needs? Another point we've found, and just an interesting kind of side note, the staffing utilization and staff studies that we've done in communication centers is, one of the issues is if it's a center that's relying on county or city HR or personnel for recruitment, they don't always have this understanding of 24/7 and of the stress levels and of and then the wage competition, right? I mean, you're asking for people to work third shift, and you're not necessarily keeping up with wages in the labor market. So in other words, educating your local HR or your personnel department about the unique recruiting and evaluation screening needs of those types of people. And then I think the other point that we've, just to sum up, is it's really, we talk a lot about the role of the dispatcher changing, but now as part of the conversation, and you guys both kind of touched on this, is there another role, right? Is there a role of distilling all of this information, letting the dispatcher dispatch, and having another type of person that's absorbing all the social media, all the situational awareness, and providing that either to the dispatcher or to the first responders. So all the other staffing pressures that we're all aware of in the labor market, and then kind of this shifting roles that technology's kind of fostered or pushed on us. What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. And there's between 5,500 to 6,000 ECCs across the country, and every one of them and Maria made that point, every one of them handles things differently. And a lot of them are fearful because, again, you have to answer. I mean, your staffing has to answer the 911 call, so you can't just let all the phones ring while you're analyzing data, right? And so, and I don't want to get off on a tangent on this, but that was something with some of the sessions today. I know ECCs are kind of newer to IJIS versus, criminal justice and a lot of the data, but a lot of the analytics and a lot of the topics here, I think can provide insight into what information might be important to get to the officer or the first responder at the get-go. Help, whether it's an AI model that can do it, I mean, that's great, but what do they need to know? They don't need to know everything, and sometimes you get ECCs, the dispatchers, they're just providing any information they've got in a call because they don't know necessarily what the officer needs to make a good decision, for example. And now maybe we'll get into this in the next question. We throw mental health into it, so I'll skip that. But there's a lot of information that could make, that you can get in a few seconds at the beginning, because again, seconds count, that you could get to the responder that will make a difference. And there may be a lot of information they don't need. And I'll use the example. It's like if a medical call. I mean, often oftentimes, more often than not, it's not somebody trained, it's not a paramedic that's taking medical calls. And in fact, industry shows that if you get somebody like a paramedic or EMT that takes medical calls, that they often try and read too much into it rather than just get help going. And so, but what information is crucial? What information does the medic need to know? And it's the same across whatever discipline. And the person taking it may not really know, this information here is useless, so why even air it? So being able to provide that insight, I think, is very important into the ECC. And there's a lot of work that you folks are all doing out there that I think we could benefit from.
So I think we talked a little bit about the staffing and the challenges, and I think it's an important takeaway to look that the roles are changing. And I think when you define, to the point earlier of a telecommunicator, that's one role. I know I had a conversation just last night, and somebody was saying, do you need a social media person inside your ECCs? And I think a lot of what's happening too, and it was mentioned earlier that with the evolution of the ECCs and things moving out of law enforcement, because it used to be if you talked your dispatch center, it was underneath law enforcement. That's not the case anymore, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of them were mentioned earlier, but those roles are changing, and so you're asked to do more. And we've talked a lot about already information coming from the public coming in. There was a little reference, and Sarah, you made it, but there's also the information that comes from the responders back. And that's now coming in different ways. And so that evolution of data and feedback and rapid feedback and new data and that back and forth is becoming more of a challenge. So going down that data path, and you talked a little bit about what we really need to work on is filtering the data. But we bridged a little bit to Next Gen 911. So I'd kind of like thoughts on, what do you think the challenges that are being brought forward with Next Gen 911? When you look at the mandate for it, in theory, all ECCs are already compliant and are already accepting all of that data. We know that's not the case. So what are some of the reasons why that's been such a challenge? And I know, Bob, you mentioned the technology and just well, that's not the way we've done it. And I was surprised when you admitted that you were a volunteer firefighter that the room didn't empty, since we're criminal justice more than anything else. But don't worry, I got your back on that one. But the challenges that are going with all that new data coming in, and an understanding of what to deal with it, how to deal with it, because it's not just your traditional data anymore. It's the video, it's the text, it's all the other things. So comments, thoughts?
So I can start to kind of share of what we've done. So a lot of what we've been doing is we're either creating kind of the new technology and testing that, or we're funding innovators, researchers, academics to do that. Primarily, we've focused most of the money that we've received from Congress to achieve this one-time advanced research and development through funding outside innovators. And we usually always have to start with, imagine a first responder has access to the data about their own city. Because they do not have access to information that is even withheld in their own municipality because of data ownership, of lack of standards. The data comes in so many formats. And so it seems simple, but often, if this is a new first responder or a firefighter responding to a call, they don't know where you are inside of a mall necessarily, unless they've been there and they've lived there and that's the mall that they go to. And the public has no awareness really of what kind of information first responders have when they are responding to a call. So a lot of new technology still has to be developed with artificial data, or kind of this understanding that we are not in a place where first responders have access to the data they need to do their jobs. And so I'll start there. There's a lot of things that we've been doing at NIST PSCR, and we have a lot of open source data sets that I'd be happy to share a little bit later, and even some differential privacy algorithms and contests we've been running on how can we share that information, removing PII, but still keep it available for public safety and individuals. So we've done a lot of different components in the past few years. But I think to answer your question, Ed, is first responders just don't have access to the data that they need today to do their jobs. And that's part of the problem. Solving it is a very complicated layer of security, of technology, of hardware, software, of data ownership. And there's a lot of players that are working in that space. But I'll kind of start that and then kick it to Bob to see if he has any of the actual experience as the first responder.
Actually, you made me think of something when you were talking about mandates and in legislation, and sometimes the most well-intentioned legislation, as we all know, doesn't get enacted like it should. And I'll just use an example here. Being from Florida, I guess I can do that, right? And well-intentioned legislation, and New Jersey passed one as well. After the Parkland shooting, the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, legislation came out for Alyssa's Law. It was called Alyssa's Law after one of the students that died in the tragedy. And it was for schools within Florida to have basically a panic alert, a button, a device, something they carried with them, or they could do it in the classroom, but to initiate an emergency that would lock down the school and inform administrative staff, but B, would integrate, and you all know that word, integrate. This was in the legislation. It was like 2 sentences, and integrate to public safety answering points, and they did use public safety answering points. And of course, a lot of the solutions that were out there, the button part was easy, but how do you integrate into a PSAP? And several of them came out with, you open a web client, you open a tab, you log in with your credentials, and you leave that open in the comm center forever. And then, if you ever have an incident, you'll get all that information there. Again, back to the guardians of the technology, that is not integrated in any way, shape, or form. And how likely, we hope we never have an incident in our community. How likely is that to be up if that is initiated, actually be logged in and visible? Who's making sure it's working? So many things that got left out, and it wasn't part of the process at all. There's technology out there with some implementations, and to me personally, it would make sense if you initiate an incident or if you receive one of those alerts, it should actually create an incident directly in your CAD because it has all the information you need. Why do you need the voice call in that particular incident? Let's create an incident right to send to law enforcement to tell them, panic button's been alerted in room 302 at this school. And I'll be honest, in our county, their initial run out of this was sending an email to the dispatch supervisor group. Well, the last thing dispatch supervisors are doing during any busy time is looking at their email, right? So just completely useless. So I kind of went off a little bit about the data and the certain legislation, but it has to be useful and it has to be implemented in a way. And since there are a lot of practitioners here, that's just something. There is a way to do a lot of this, and we've seen a lot of innovative ways, but it needs to be thoughtful. And I know that's a lot of what PSCR is working on, especially in the responder. And I appreciate the work you guys are doing because it's really helping us look out for the next 5-10 years and see what's possible and what data will be beneficial, and getting that from the practitioners directly. A lot of good work being done. So, and thank you for all of you that are providing those services.
It's interesting. It's back to Nancy's comment about implementation science. The best technology, the best solutions need to be implemented correctly. So Next Gen 911 is really a huge leap. You've gone through it, right, Bob? It's a paradigm shift, but it's not unlike other challenges that those of us who work more in criminal justice it's a change and it needs to be managed, and there are frameworks to apply. So it's everything that applies to system replacement, change management that we all encounter. It's good governance. It's expanding that role of that circle of stakeholders, right? Because now you do have more information providers with the capability to communicate with the center. That needs to be, those people need to be brought in. It's paying attention to change management, to the human element of how is this going to affect telecommuters, dispatchers who've known one way of interacting with the technology, and and it's not to oversimplify it, but it's basic project management, right? You need somebody who's been there before and who understands all of the different moving parts, and the moving parts are unique in Next Gen 911, right? County GIS plays more of a role. You've got location services instead of the selective router, things like that. So, but it comes back down to good change management, good project management, just kind of putting the unique demands of Next Gen 911 transition into that framework in some ways. Not to oversimplify.
So talking through that a little bit, and there were a couple observations there that I take away. One is that information exchange and that willingness to break down the silos. But I think even within the first responder community, there's some of that information. I know in the county that I worked in, there was a whole debate of should the fire service be allowed to see the premise hazards that the police are able to see every time they go. And why was that not allowed? Because there was concern of, well, what if we show them information they shouldn't see? So that's a combination of policy, but also just a combination of, as you hit it, we've all done it this way, the same way. And I laugh sometimes because we all get along really, really well, and we do our jobs great. But then there's the whole, but don't come into my silo. And I think the ECCs and Next Gen 911 are really challenging that. And one of the areas that we see, and we talked a little bit about, is some of the security aspects of things, and who is the data owner, who has responsibilities. And Bob, your point is well taken about the legislation, because in a lot of it, it's pushing security requirements on the ECCs that they don't necessarily have the ability to manage or do those types of things. And I know, Sarah, when you and I talked a little bit, it also affects just the ability to do some of the challenges and do some of the systems that were going on. So I don't want to throw cybersecurity out there as an aspect in things, because it's such a buzzword and such a general topic. But do you see challenges within policy or within security systems? And I'll stop with going not down the cyber framework or security framework, but just some of those challenges. And is there ways that we can help tackle those or where are those challenges so that everybody's more aware of them?
So absolutely, I was looking for the model, but I carry my government work phone and I carry my personal cell phone. That is, if you ask most first responders, they add their land mobile radio to that. And so then they have 3 communication devices. We are seeing a lot of court cases where they are now confiscating all 3 of those devices because work is being done on all 3 devices. That is a big difference. And when we've been pushing at NIST and talking about 3GPP standards and the importance of using your or not using your personal phone to respond for communication devices because of cybersecurity and other issues, that's definitely coming to the forefront for a lot of first responders now when their personal phones are being confiscated and being taken during court cases, those kind of aspects. So yes, it's definitely coming to the forefront for a lot of people's kind of minds, but it's also then highlighting the importance of single sign-ons. There's very clever ways to do multi-factor authentication, and we work a lot with our partners at First Responder Network Authority, also under the Department of Commerce, who manage FirstNet, the broadband network for first responders. And those are a lot of the issues in cybersecurity that we're focusing on for the actual devices the first responders use. But some of those same standards then have to go back to think about the emergency centers and how communication centers then are relaying that information and what aspects they have, because it all integrates and ties in together. So absolutely kind of the cybersecurity component and security issues, especially as more data is being exchanged over a variety of platforms in public safety, it's a key issue that everyone's trying to think through and focus on. Luckily, being in the research and development space, I get to work with the innovators that say, we'll solve that problem, while there's a lot of colleagues at NIST and in other public safety communities that are working on kind of standardizing and trying to understand the realism of wanting to do their job and do it quickly and do it well and save lives and property, but thinking through how to do that in a secure manner.
And I'm going to take the very simplistic 2 points. One's a request, I guess, a challenge. So the first one, ECCs know that cyber is now an issue because what they used to operate on, again, the mission critical systems used to be closed systems, right? 911 systems didn't touch anything, radio systems didn't touch anything. But now as you bring in and connecting to external networks, we know it's important, but we need to be educated and what we should do. Because a lot of us, unless we're under an enterprise IT department that already takes those actions for us, a lot, and they don't have the resources. But the second thing, and Sarah mentioned it, from a practitioner perspective, is just being able to not have to log into 15 apps. And here's my challenge. One example, and CJIS, is often is often a hurdle for us. We just started implementing a nice LMR radio that basically has LTE in it, and it's great. It has like a personal or like what would be a personal assistant like Siri or Alexa in it, where an officer could run a tag. But if that is going to, after every 15 minutes, they're going to have to log in again, how useful is that, right? I mean, so there's some real cool technology, but it's how do we work around some of these challenges? And as manufacturers, there's ways to do it. But there's some real cool technology, too, that would help, because if an officer can run their own tag, then they're not having to do it, through dispatch, and help some of the staffing things.
So just one interesting thing, all the technology, all the importance of, network assessment becomes more important because there are more entry points. Ongoing network monitoring for the same reason, understanding those vulnerabilities, monitoring what happens. But we also do security assessments for PSAPs, traditional and next-gen 911 and part of the transition, and evaluate security and vulnerability on a number of different dimensions. Physical security, network security, network monitoring in place, and user education. Physical security ranks very high for PSAPs across the board. We've kind of aggregated the results of these different assessments. As you might expect, it's a secure facility. The highest ranking or the highest risk, so the lowest ranking point of the assessments on average, we've done like 380 of these assessments, is authentication and authorization. So it's passwords, and it's weak passwords. Single sign-on can play a role there, because if I've got 15 different passwords, I got to make them all easy to remember, right? So it's interesting that it's that human element, and then kind of the user training about social engineering and phishing. That's closely related to that. So, and just an important other aspect to that.
And so not only human element, but human element at the emergency communication centers that are so passionate about their role of keeping their community safe, and then relaying that to the information to the people who are going to do that. And so the passion is there, and they want to do the right thing, but it's human element going to another person who doesn't want to worry about the technology, doesn't want to worry about the policy. They want to save the life and they save the property. So it's that extra layer that's hard when you start with the ECCs.
So I got a high sign that we have a few minutes left, so I want to take a moment and say, are there any questions that anybody would ask of the panel? Because I'm sure you can imagine we have nothing else to talk about up here. Yes, sir.
How is the implementation of 988 impacting your world with ECCs?
George, I'll just repeat it if that's these. Okay. So the question was, how is the implementation of 988 impacting the ECCs and those types of things? So I have my thoughts, but since I'm not actually in an ECC, I'm going to look to you, Bob, to see if you have any thoughts. And I know you shared some with me on the initial statistics of how the call volume went up and things affected when it was implemented.
Right, in the state of Florida, we could talk all day on this, but the number of calls to 988 did go up just because it was a more recognized number in the first, since July 16th when it was first implemented. It doesn't obviously use the same technology that 911 uses, so that it goes based on area code, which may get you somewhere near where you are, or if I have an area code for Florida and I'm in Washington State and I call, I'm going to be transferred down to a call center down here rather than where I'm actually located. So there's traditional issues. Mental health is a huge thing, and data and information at the ECC could make a huge difference. In Collier County, we have what's called a crisis call diversion, where we actually have sheriff's office employees who are mental health counselors. They were hired by the sheriff's office and then trained. Florida has a public safety telecommunicator or 911 certification. They don't answer typical 911 calls, but they're trained on the system and they sit in the ECC. And if there is a call that is like a suicidal call, mental health, drug, something that's not life-threatening, the 911 call taker transfers those calls to the crisis call diversion, the counselor, and they can set up a separate response, do follow-ups with them, and that's great. But it's limited in the number because it's based on if like I said, suicidal calls. it would be much better, and this is, again, where data can play in even the feedback loop, if there was a way to identify based on the residence, or if there was if there were other indicators that the 911 call taker had that, hey, this person may have a better response if, just get more of the help they need, if that could be somehow, the term's probably incorrect, but flagged so that call could be diverted, because I know we're missing a lot of them that are coming in, and we're just sending a law enforcement response, and we're training law enforcement in CIT and things like that, but just a way to better utilize resources and get a better response. And I'm hoping some of that data will come back out of some of these groups to be able to inform, again, those few seconds at the beginning when someone's talking to someone.
I think some of the challenges that you heard there too is the ECCs, I know some others that I've talked to are trying to figure out, are they going to handle it in-house or are they sending it out? Because you mentioned that you've got staff that are actually going to handle those calls in-house. I know other ECCs, it's a complete transfer. And the data management then of transferring the call data, transferring the information, making sure that you actually understand who the person was and how far that initial interrogation got of that call. Because I can't speak personally, but talking to some people that are on the edge, when you ask them the same questions that they've already answered for somebody else, it doesn't tend to make the situation better. So there is a lot of that information sharing and things that go with that. So.
Yeah, and the goal of the information sharing, as you guys pointed out, is for the telecommuter, dispatcher, or the first responder to recognize as quickly as possible what they're dealing with. So. Probably person-centric information sharing, because what you're talking about is, what information can the dispatcher have at their fingertips in terms of if you're able to identify the person, what their history is. So, yeah, a lot of challenges in terms of pushing information sharing forward.
Okay, Jordan, I'm going to go to you, but there's a question right behind you, and so, okay, we can take the question. All right, good.
Location information that makes the caller identifiable and could have a chilling effect on people's willingness to use 988. And yet, there are occasions where it's important and life-saving to know their location. And the last time I looked into this, which is probably about 6 months ago or so, it seemed like the policy development on that was at a standstill. And it also seemed to me that not all the right stakeholders were at the table in that conversation, primarily people who have been in crisis, families of people, members who have been suicidal or even sadly, successfully took their lives. So I'd love to hear any updates that you might have on that.
So the only update I can provide is, again, we ran an open competition where we asked researchers and provided the prize funds for solutions about a temporal map data, or differential privacy challenge. So we asked them to use different privacy algorithms where the data sets were still intact, but PII was removed, and so information could be shared more easily across public safety databases. And so we used geographical situated data and kind of showed how a person's location could be tracked and moved in time, but still removing PII. And so the results of that were really exciting. And a few months ago, the United States and both the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy and the United Kingdom were excited about kind of those results that came from a public safety data challenge, and are now launching a series of challenges together. One is focusing on financial crime, and the other is bolstering pandemic response, but trying to use temporal data and differential privacy algorithms. So it's not quite that, but that's kind of our hat at PSCR of how we've been trying to influence and help make that kind of response easier.
Okay, so I want to thank you all. You all made my job easy, so I appreciate that. And thank you all very much for taking the time to listen.